How likely is it, do you think, that Netanyahu will be able to keep his government going? And I suppose if he can't, then how likely is it that we end up with an Israeli general election?
I think the thinking at the moment is that Netanyahu has managed to pull this off, as he so often tends to do. He may have to sacrifice Itamar Ben-Gvir, this far-right public security minister, and his 6 MPs, members of the Knesset, but he seems to have kept the other far-right party, that of Bezalel Smotrich, in the government for now, even if they oppose the deal, and he can get the deal through on the votes of the opposition. Now, the only problem with this is that Smotrich says that he wants a guarantee that Netanyahu will return to fighting. He wants, at the end of the first prisoner exchange, the 42 days, a guarantee that Netanyahu will, in fact, return to fighting Hamas until Hamas is destroyed. Now, that, of course, is not the understanding of what this ceasefire is all about for the rest of the world. Certainly, the mediators assumed that it was, an end to the fighting, a permanent ceasefire, or at least as permanent as anything is in this part of the world. So, there is a contradiction there between what we think we have in a deal here and what the far right in Netanyahu's government are expecting.
The 6 weeks, we've now got this 6-week ceasefire. You've touched on it there. How likely is it, do you think, that Israel and Hamas and all the mediators can actually get a second phase and a third phase across the line come, the start of March when this 6-week phase ends?
Yeah, so this is the key question, and it's a lot depends from which perspective you look at it. The first 2 phases of the deal, at least, look fairly straightforward. There's a fairly clear agreement on the release of hostages for prisoners, down to very tight details of how many prisoners are released and of what sort, in return for what sort of hostage. So military hostages get more prisoners released in exchange than civilian hostages. Women and children get exchanged for women and children. Men hostages get exchanged for prisoners who are accused of terrorist crimes, for example. So there's a clear rationale for both phases. So first phase, first 6 weeks, you have the women and children and the older men. The second phase, you have all the other living hostages, and then the third phase is the bodies of other hostages in return for more prisoners. So you might say, logically, if there were to be a return to conflict, Israel might wait until the end of the second phase. At the moment, Netanyahu is not guaranteed there will be no resumption of fighting, that he won't continue to go after Hamas. He has made the destruction of Hamas as, one of the key goals of the war. He says he's not giving that up. And as I say, Bezalel Smotrich, one of his cabinet ministers, says that's his condition for not bringing the government down, not taking his MPs, his members of the Knesset out of the government. So, it's not straightforward. There are two hurdles. There's the end of the first phase and the end of the second phase, of which this deal could easily collapse. And as I say, there's no guarantee, because the third phase, is still subject to negotiation. There are still negotiations about, what happens after, what reconstruction is allowed in Gaza, and who gets to run it. Now, of course, the key thing for Israel is that Hamas should not get to run that reconstruction. But, Hamas is still there. They still have fighters there. They still have leaders there. So they will, of course, want to be involved. And, that won't be acceptable to Israel. So that impasse, that long-term impasse also remains to be settled.
For Hamas, let's touch on them. What do they do for the next 6 weeks? Do they start coming out of their tunnels, or what does it mean for them going forward?
Yeah, they're not a sort of uniformed army as such. So, you won't see who is out of the tunnels or not. I imagine the leaders that Israel can identify, for example, Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, the overall leader in Gaza, who was killed back in October. Mohammed Sinwar is now believed to be the effective leader of Hamas in Gaza. I don't suppose we'll see him on the ground, but of course, there won't be much to distinguish your average Hamas fighter from a civilian male. when all those millions of Gazans start to return to their homes or what's left of them. So we will start to see certainly some of the civilian apparatus of government returning. So again, looking at the destruction there, it's a question of what it's returning to. So yes, the whole question of, how do you set up a governing authority in a territory like Gaza if the Israelis withdraw, so you don't have a military governance, but you don't want Hamas to reassert their dominance, their control, then who do you put in charge, and how do you ensure that they are actually in charge? There's no real answer to that question at the moment.
As part of this 6-week ceasefire, you're going to see Palestinian prisoners released. Some of them, members of the Israeli cabinet, parliament, are not happy with the sorts of people that are being released. Would they be reintegrated back into Hamas immediately? What will they start playing a role in 6 weeks' time?
So that's a very good question, and it actually goes to one of the few points that we simply don't know about. So one of the issues, one of the agreements in this deal we know is that among the prisoners released will be no less than, for example, 50 Palestinian prisoners serving life terms. So those are people serving life terms for terrorist offences, as Israel would regard it, murderers, people who led hostile operations against Israel, depending on how you term these things. There is talk that they will be sent into exile, so not allowed to go back to either the West Bank or Gaza. There's talk about them going to exile in Qatar. One very important name that's being discussed is that of Marwan Barghouti, who is regarded by many Palestinians as their sort of leader in prison, if you like. He was a leader of the Intifada, the two uprisings against Israeli rule in the occupied territories in Israel itself in the late 80s and early 90s, and again in the early 2000s. He's very popular with all factions in the Palestinian cause, but Israel regard him as a murderer. He's currently serving 5 life terms for murder. We don't know if his name is on the list and to be freed. If he is freed, we don't know where he will end up, whether he will be sent to Qatar. I can't imagine he will be allowed to go and set up in the West Bank or in Gaza. So again, there's a bit of a sort of contradiction or moral quandary, if you like, in that, Israel could release, leaders of the Palestinian cause who are not affiliated with Hamas, like Marwan Barghouti, who have respect from all the factions, who could take up a governing role, but by virtue of the offences for which they are imprisoned, Israel is not going to want them to see them go back to the West Bank or Gaza and take up those roles. So who does that leave Israel, putting in charge, if you want to look at that like that, of, the rebuilding of Gaza?
And Israel said that Hamas, in their view, that militarily has been destroyed over the last 15 months in Gaza. So does Hamas start building up that capability again, or does it now focus on trying to rebuild its political reputation with its links to Iran, or what's left of Hezbollah in Lebanon, or across the Middle East?
Yeah, there's absolutely no sign that Hamas is giving up the military struggle. There is no sign of it saying, okay, we messed up. We shouldn't have been a military resistance. We should have been a political faction prepared to operate more or less in conjunction with Israel in Gaza and, competing for power in the West Bank, trying to be a mainstream political movement for the Palestinians. It is a military force. It is committed to military resistance. It talks about ceasefires. It certainly does not talk about a permanent end to its military use of force. So the assumption is that, particularly now that this ceasefire has been done without a commitment by Hamas to disarm, that it will try to rearm. Israel will be doing its best to make sure that it doesn't happen. And I'd say that's why Israel would say, that's why Netanyahu would say, it is insisting on the right to resume the war if it needs to.
And in 6 weeks' time, if the ceasefire holds and you've got Hamas who aren't giving up the military struggle, you might have Netanyahu considering going back to fighting Hamas to keep some of his coalition on side. His spectre has been hanging over this whole ceasefire deal, but Donald Trump will be 6 weeks into his second term in office. His feet will be well under the Resolute desk. What impact will that have on Netanyahu's relationship with the US, on the peace process in general, and how you get to stages 2 and 3 of this ceasefire?
Yeah, well, so the story you're hearing out of Washington is very much one of America trying to claim credit for this ceasefire deal, whether Biden or Trump or both. Biden for the long negotiations and the fact that the ceasefire deal that's been agreed is pretty similar to the one he originally proposed back in May, or Trump because his envoy, bullied both sides to get this deal over the line. That's the way it's been spun in Washington. It's not the way I see things. It seems to me much more likely that, Netanyahu was under a lot of pressure to bring the remaining hostages home, which he had not managed to do by military means. It suited him to do a deal now. He has, this is, if you like, a sort of welcome gift to Trump, who did make that threat, saying, I want a deal done before I start office, which he's getting on Sunday. Trump is inaugurated on Monday. And in return for that, I think Netanyahu will expect a certain amount of tolerance from Trump and is likely to get it. Trump has surrounded himself, as was always likely, with very strong pro-Israel team, a very pro-Israel U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, a Christian Zionist. He's got very pro-Israel envoys. I think if Netanyahu goes back to war, he would expect Trump to support him, and I think Trump probably will.